The current chronology that we use to break up the past tends to, broadly speaking, be broken up into several discrete chunks, bookended by what we understand in the modern day to be significant historical events. So broadly, this is what we understand to be ancient, classical, medieval, Renaissance, or early modern history, and then eventually, the modern era. And all of these can be broken down even more, and you can add in things like prehistory, which then leads us to what's known as the Three-Age System, or Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. And you can tweak this even further by throwing in the Copper Age, and you can subdivide the Stone Age into different segments. This is where Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic come into play. And these various divisions lead me to the topic of this video. In the modern day, we have a period that we call ancient history, and it's populated by what we understand to be ancient civilizations. If, however, you were to go back to the ancient era or even the classical era, how would they understand the past? Did ancient civilizations have ancient civilizations of their own? This is sort of a difficult question to answer, but it's a fun one. And the answer is both yes and no at the same time, depending on how you look at it. In a way, we're not really asking whether or not these older cultures had a notion of history, that is, the recorded past, so much as we're asking about the status of ancient and classical knowledge about that past, how they knew what they knew or thought they knew, and about their historiography. So what I want to do in this video then is take a look at a few different examples, starting with the most recent ones and then moving backward through time into earlier cultures and civilizations. But before I get to that, I want to take a couple of seconds and just briefly address what this video is and what it is not. There are a ton of different examples you can look at when you try to answer this question, and at some point, I know somebody in the comments is going to write something along the lines of, well, what about Stonehenge, or Newgrange, or the various standing stones and megaliths throughout Europe, and Eurasia more broadly, and North and South America as well. I am not dealing with that sort of thing in this video, not because ancient and classical peoples didn't have thoughts about it, or because it does not deserve an answer, but because it's a slightly different question, which involves a slightly different answer, and dealing with things like megaliths, and barrow tombs, and thunderstones, things of that nature, various artifacts that aren't clearly associated with what ancient peoples would consider to be a civilization, very quickly leaves the realm of what they thought history was in the past, and it starts getting into things like folklore. So you start dealing with things like the Fae and Wights and other things of that nature. So it's going to be a separate video. In this one, we're going to be talking about some texts and some archaeology. Anyway, the first example is going to be centered around the classical Greeks. But before we get to that, we have to understand how the Greeks conceptualized the past. Essentially, there were two sort of separate but sort of interwoven ideas. On the one hand, you have the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, and you have the histories written by Herodotus. Thucydides attempted to base his history on as many facts and reliable information that he could possibly gather, and he claimed to write with impartial detachment. His account is generally what we understand to be the beginning of scientific history. Herodotus, on the other hand, did not necessarily attempt to verify every single thing he wrote about, although he tried when and where he was able to do so. The Histories is largely an account of the Greco-Persian War, although other places, people, and events are included in it, including tall tales and legends, for which Herodotus was ridiculed both in his own day and in the present, hence his moniker, the Father of Lies. The overall point, however, is that both of these Greek historians were writing about events, broadly speaking, in their own day, and, to a degree, in the past as regards Herodotus. So their conception of history is something as largely being here and now, quote-unquote. The other conception of the past in the Greek mind was one of succeeding ages, in which each age was a deterioration of the previous one. And this also shows up in the writings of Herodotus, just as one example. These are generally known as the Ages of Man, and they come from Hesiod's Works and Days and his Theogony, broadly contemporaneous with Homer, if Homer did indeed exist, so roughly the 8th century BC. He believed that mankind was living in the Iron Age, and in the Iron Age life was violent and it was generally unpleasant. Before that came the Age of Heroes, when Jason and the Argonauts and Heracles and the other heroes of Greek myth roamed the earth. In each age, men became smaller, which is why you read in surviving sources from the Greek world of finds of things like giant bones and things of that nature. Now, these could be fossils, that's entirely possible, but in the context of the Greek outlook on the world, that is, the Iron Age, it fits the schema better to interpret these supposed finds as related to the deterioration of those previous ages. So, when it comes to Greek conceptions of what we would understand to be ancient history, at some point, you leave the mental framework of somebody like Thucydides, and eventually, you enter into the realm of mythology, folklore, and the 5 ages of man. Now, the Greeks were very aware that there were cultures older than theirs, and they were very honest about which cultures those were, such as Egypt. But ruins and things of that nature, past a certain point, were explained by reference to the 5 ages of man. They were aware of some sort of a deep past, but they did not properly understand what those things were or how deep that past actually was. And past a certain point, they tried to take what they saw around them and fit it into this mythological chronology that moved from a tangible, verifiable history into essentially the realm of myth. So, in 401 BC, Cyrus the Younger attempted to claim the throne of Persia and thus take it from his brother, Artaxerxes II. But in order to do that, Cyrus required an army, and being the satrap of Lydia and Ionia, he did have some resources, but perhaps not enough for what he was planning to do. So, he very famously hired an army, primarily of Greeks known to us as the 10,000. This army marched into the sands of the Near East, and about 70 kilometers north of Babylon they fought at the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC. And although they won, Cyrus was killed in the fighting. And hence the 10,000 have a problem. They're now stuck way behind enemy lines, and they have to figure out a way to get back home. So Cunaxa was fought near the city of Babylon, and hence the 10,000 were standing in a very ancient land, where at that point, recorded history as we understand it today, having found ancient clay tablets and other records, goes back about 3,000 or 4,000 years from the time the 10,000 were standing there. And it's an area where soldiers and kings had fought and died for millennia by this point. It's a pattern that's really never stopped. The Near East is sometimes called the crossroads of the world, and for good reason. It's where some of the first civilizations arose, and the ghosts of those civilizations still dotted the landscape in the form of ruins during the time of the classical Greeks. Now Xenophon, one of the leaders of the 10,000 and their principal historian, recorded in the 4th chapter of the 3rd book of his account that the army had to cross some sort of a gorge. But when they tried to do this, they were attacked. The Greeks did beat off their opponents, and they marched the rest of the day. And eventually, they reached the banks of the Tigris River. And when they got there, Xenophon recorded that there were the ruins of 2 cities nearby. He calls them Larissa and Mespila. And he also tells us that both of these cities were once occupied by the Medes. The problem, though, is that these are actually the wrong names. And he kind of identified the wrong people. Although the Medes did occupy these 2 cities, they were built actually by the Assyrians. Larissa is the city known to the Assyrians as Nimrod, and Mespila is the city known as Nineveh, the capital of the great Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Neo-Assyrian Empire fell around 609 BC, with Nimrod falling to a combined Babylonian-Median assault in 614 BC, and Nineveh falling and essentially being burned, looted, and horribly sacked in 612. Another way of putting this is that about only 200 years separate the collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire from the march of the 10,000. Now, I wrote the script for this video towards the end of 2024. 209 years ago was the Battle of Waterloo, and with it, the end of Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon's era, and the end of the French Revolution and French Revolutionary Wars more broadly. This is one of the most well-known and one of the most intensively studied periods, given its immense importance for the modern world. Apparently, more biographies and works on Napoleon have been written since there are days since he died. We know about him. And yet, during the time of Xenophon, looking at a comparable time span, about 200 years, he seems to know nothing about the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And this essentially seems to have vanished from memory. Nineveh, the famous capital, was abandoned. So what are we to make of this? Well, Nineveh and Nimrod were not cities designed to support themselves. That is to say that these were administrative centers first and foremost, that depended on tribute and taxes and resources gained from outside. So while Nineveh was eventually resettled and eventually rebuilt during the Seleucid Empire, after the collapse of Assyria, the ideology and the bureaucratic structures that enabled something like Nineveh to even exist were no longer needed. The state essentially disintegrated. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was a state that was heavily based around conquest, tribute, and population transfers. When a region was conquered, it was not unusual for the Assyrians to force large percentages of the population to move to somewhere else in the empire. Think of the mass movements of the ethnic Germans and ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union in the 20th century to get some sort of a visual picture on what this may have looked like. We're talking hundreds of thousands, if not eventually millions of people. Seems to be one of the main reasons for the collapse of this state. It produced structural weaknesses, and after the sack of Nineveh, other, more local powers took over, and because they did not base themselves around the same sort of ideology of world conquest that the Assyrians did, the impact of that state began to fade. Now, the Greeks did know about Assyria. They were very clear about this. They knew a state called Assyria existed in the Near East at some point. The problem is they don't seem to have been very clear on when at some point actually was. It shows up in the writing, it shows up in the writing of the Persians, and it shows up in the Old Testament, but very quickly it seems that the memory of the Assyrian Empire became pretty garbled and pretty murky. The Greeks knew of Assyria, but very quickly their understanding starts dealing with things like mythical kings and the like, so that 2 centuries or so later, by the time of Xenophon, the 10,000 apparently don't even realize where they're standing. These cities, while they were recognized as cities, were misattributed to the Medians, and other ruins, such as those of Urartu, an early Iron Age kingdom in eastern Turkey and Armenia, were misidentified as being Assyrian. So essentially, the entire historical memory becomes very murky very fast. Thus far, we've largely been talking about Greek conceptions of the past, but there are even older civilizations, and in this case, some of our best evidence for answering this type of question comes from the Babylonians, specifically the Neo-Babylonians, who overthrew the Neo-Assyrians with some help from the Medes, and their king Nabonidus, who ruled the Neo-Babylonian Empire between about 556 and about 539 BC, has sometimes been called the world's first archaeologist, and his daughter, Analdi, kept a museum apparently filled with several dozen ancient artifacts. The ancient Mesopotamians had a very clear conception of some sort of a long-standing historical tradition, although not necessarily in the way that we would understand it. Their conception revolved heavily around religion and legitimizing claims to rulership, hence the past was considered deeply important because it formed something like cultural capital to help reinforce those claims to leadership. Today, the city of Akkad, the capital of the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in recorded history that we know of, is actually lost, and although there are some ideas about where it might be located, including a specific site near modern-day Baghdad, the kings of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which spanned about 626 BC to 539 BC, including the aforementioned Nabonidus, apparently knew where the city was, and apparently they excavated portions of it and engaged in what we would understand to be something like restoration work. So, in this sense, yes, ancient peoples did have genuine ancient civilizations of their own, and for the rest of this video, we're essentially going to be talking about what can be described as Neo-Babylonian archaeology of their Babylonian, Assyrian, and Akkadian past. Ancient Mesopotamia has a long, long tradition of sacred kingship, and this is basically what forms the background to the archaeology conducted not only by Nabonidus, but other Neo-Babylonian kings like Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II. Sites were not just selected for excavation or restoration work at random. Instead, it was often revealed to the monarchs through some sort of a divine intervention, like a dream, or a rainstorm, or a flood, something of that nature, which we'll be talking about more in a minute, and the excavations were done to fulfill divine will. The sites chosen for excavation in this manner were the major cities of the ancient Near East. Babylon, for fairly obvious reasons, as it was the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and an ancient city in its own right, certainly by the time of Nabonidus, but also Akkad, Nippur, Larsa, Sippar, Kish, Uruk, and Ur. And at Ur specifically, there does actually appear to be evidence that the Great Ziggurat of the Ur III period, otherwise known as the Neo-Sumerian Empire, which dates between about the 22nd and about the 21st centuries BC, was actually expanded during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Another way of conceptualizing that is that the Neo-Babylonians restored and expanded a temple complex which was something like 1700 years old by that point. The structure had evidently fallen into disrepair by the time of the Neo-Babylonian state, and when it was excavated in the early 20th century, the original foundations were uncovered, as well as much later restoration at the top of the ziggurat, dating to the time of King Nabonidus. And in Akkad, Nebuchadnezzar II was looking for the temple of Ishtar, the famous Ulmash, and he dug trenches in the city attempting to locate the foundations of this building. Now, he apparently failed, but evidently, Nabonidus claims to have succeeded in this endeavor. He apparently found the foundations of this temple. And we have 4 different texts concerning the restoration of ancient temples. And here, I mean ancient even to the Neo-Babylonians. They come to us in the form of 3 cylinder seals and 1 tablet, and they tell us that Nabonidus restored 4 different temples. And according to those records, Nabonidus' workers were digging in the trenches dug by Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years, expanding and going in different directions, and still, they found nothing. Until, as luck would have it, or divine intervention in keeping with the understanding of the Neo-Babylonian kings, a sudden rainstorm created a channel in the earth, and Nabonidus halted work in the trenches, and he ordered his workers and field directors to dig in that spot, and apparently, this is where they located the temple to Ishtar. Now, is that real? Well, you would be forgiven if you were to say no, because that does just sound like either divine intervention or really just plain dumb luck, but Nabonidus may indeed have found this temple. The city of Akkad today is lost, but there is an archaeological site called the Tel Mohammed, which is one of the proposed locations for the city, and excavation there by modern-day archaeologists has revealed a temple not of the Neo-Babylonian period, but of a much older era, potentially Akkadian, and it contains work credited to King Nabonidus. Texts were also important in this regard, and evidently the older the writing, the better. A great example here is the Tablet of Shamash, or the Tablet of the Sun God. So this tablet was discovered in the early 1880s during excavation, and it was found broken into 8 different pieces, and it dates to about the 9th century BC, associated with Nabu-apla-iddina, king of Babylon. And there are 15 passages written on this tablet, and it tells us, essentially, that somewhere on the western bank of the Euphrates, an image of the god baked in clay was located. That image was recognized as being very, very old, from at least the Old Babylonian period, so about 1894 BC to about 1595 BC. In other words, several hundred years before this king managed to get a hold of it. And he used it to reconstitute a cult of this sun god. We can tell that this god is older than the 9th century basically by the artwork. It doesn't match the styles of the 9th century, and because we don't live in the 9th century, a way to maybe think about this would be, and the examples are not going to be exact, but it would be sort of like having, let's say, an Andy Warhol painting dating to the 1960s, and you know it's the 1960s, but there's also a figure in the painting that looks like it came right out of a Viking runestone from the 10th century in Sweden. It stands out, and it's very clearly older. So 200 years later, Nabonidus, the main subject of this portion of the video, evidently found this same tablet, and when he did, there were 2 copies of it that had been made, and the original was housed in a fired clay box for safekeeping, and this was encased in clay for further protection, which produced a copy of the tablet on either side. And while Neo-Babylonians were certainly interested in the history of the ancient Near East, and while they did undertake archaeological digs to excavate the past and to use old artifacts and images, like the image of Shamash, to bolster their claims to imperial rulership, they were certainly not above forgeries in the pursuit of that attempt to bolster their claims. The key artifact here is the Thecrucifer Monument of Tushu, discovered in 1881. And this is an inscribed stone whose writing attempts to establish the artifact as being Akkadian, but which was actually shown to be a Neo-Babylonian forgery, although at one point it was thought to be an Old Babylonian forgery. It claimed to be created at the behest of Tushu, the son of Sargon of Akkad, and it declares that the renewal of the worship of the god Shamash and his associated rites should take place, but it, in fact, is not. What matters, though, is that it shows very clearly that the textual record mattered to people like Nabonidus and the Neo-Babylonian kings, and it shows that they had some sort of an idea about what it would have taken to establish imperial legitimacy by drawing on the deep past and on ancient religion. And it's because of the importance placed on religion that the Neo-Babylonian kings emphasized digging down to the actual foundations of ancient temples and restoring them where possible. Nabonidus uncovered the Temple of Ishtar at Akkad, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, and which archaeologists in the modern day may have found. And when he restored the temple, he made it extremely clear that the bricks of the restored building were to be placed on the tops of the original foundations and to be exactly on top. It was to be as if the temple had never fallen into ruin in the first place. Nabopolassar, the first king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, basically did something similar with the walls of Babylon itself, excavating down to the foundations, and when he located it, he took it as a divine sign and then he rebuilt them, incorporating the original foundations into his construction. When the Neo-Babylonian kings did things like this, they explicitly looked for the foundation deposits, usually taking the form of a text. I am so-and-so, I ordered this construction, that sort of thing. They apparently read them, or claimed they did, claimed they could read this old writing, and they had their own foundation tablets made as close as possible to the original, and placed them alongside the ancient ones and then rebuilt the structure. Now this would have been extremely easy to just demolish the ruins and start again from scratch, but the care that Nabonidus and his fellow kings showed for the ancient past is not only remarkable, but it was designed to establish themselves as the inheritors of ancient religious practices, to venerate the same or similar gods, and thus, in that sense, to claim to be the legitimate successors of the ancient kings. Now, some of those artifacts were gathered and they were put on display, basically for the same purposes, and this is where we get to the famous Museum of Analdi, the daughter of Nabonidus and the priestess of the moon god Sin, at the city of Ur. This was a religious office which had not been filled in over 600 years, and it was resurrected by Nabonidus. Once again, we see the attempts of a Neo-Babylonian king to claim legitimacy by utilizing the ancient past. Her museum is probably the first one in the world, or at least it's the earliest one that we know about with any certainty, and it contained dozens of artifacts from across southern Mesopotamia, spanning over 1,000 years. Now, there was another museum in Babylon, or what we think was a museum. It's been disputed because apparently not all the artifacts came from the same area of the dig site, that was attributed to King Nabonidus and may have been used by earlier kings like Nebuchadnezzar II, if that's indeed what this structure was. Temples also functioned in this manner, and many of the artifacts that have been brought up in this video, the Thecrucifer Monument, the Sun Tablet, as well as inscribed Akkadian maces and bowls from the Uruk period, basically the first city in the ancient Near East, and which were repaired at some point in antiquity apparently, were found by archaeologists in the 1880s at a Neo-Babylonian temple dedicated to the god Shamash in the city of Sippar. Essentially, this functioned as a museum. So, just a couple examples to try and answer this question. Did ancient civilizations have ancient civilizations of their own? Yes, they did, but their understanding of what those civilizations actually were very often were not accurate. So that's it for this one, everybody. If you want to do some more reading about this subject and really go on a deep dive, the sources I've used for the research in this video are going to be listed in the description, and they are an excellent jumping off point. Take care, everybody. If you're dealing with the hurricanes in the south of the US, please stay safe. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time.